Alice knew she'd been right. These were good spider people. She always had fun playing with bugs and spiders and things, and despite them scaring her mom, the spiders never bit Alice. Of course, she could understand why Scott was scared of the big ones. She'd seen the smaller spiders eat plenty of bugs before, so it made sense that he'd be afraid the big ones would eat people, especially after that first one chased them. But whatever the reason, they were good now. First, one had saved her from the water. Now this one was helping her find her camp again. Of course, Alice felt bad now. She knew Scott didn't mean the things he'd said. He was scared and tired, just like Alice. He was so smart and clever, making their leaf tents and building traps for food. But she knew he wasn't sleeping well, always going to sleep last, waking up first, and crying out in his sleep all night long. He missed their mom, just like Alice did. She shouldn't have run away like this. Then she'd gotten lost. Alice tried to find her way back, but nothing looked right, and after a while, she ended up in the middle of the forest with no idea where she was or how to get back. That was when one of the spider people showed up. At first, she remembered what Scott said about them wanting to eat her and was a little scared, but the spider person waited patiently, and when Alice got close, it started leading her in a new direction. It didn't take too long for the spider person to lead her back to the camp, but Scott wasn't there yet. Maybe he was out looking for Alice? Still, Alice had always been told to thank people when they helped her, so she turned to her guide.
Thank you, Mr. Spider Person.
It tilted its whole body slightly to the side, like a dog tilting its head, then turned around and skittered toward one of Scott's drying racks. The fires were long cooled, so there was no smoke when it pried open the leaf door. Alice wasn't sure what it was trying to do, but then her stomach growled, and she decided maybe it was hungry like her. So she walked over to the drying rack and grabbed a couple of pieces of dried meat. She gave one to the spider and started munching on the other. It wasn't very tasty, but at least it wasn't as icky as some of the meat from the other animals Scott had cooked. But it did make her thirsty, so she walked over to the creek to get some water, wondering if Scott would return soon. Scott was hungry, thirsty, cold, and exhausted. Because he'd been slowly chasing his sister, he'd lost her in the underbrush and began searching the forest. He'd been looking for her ever since. But night was approaching, and Scott knew that if he didn't get food and water, he would collapse eventually. So he decided to go back to camp, grab a quick bite to eat and some water, then make himself a torch to keep looking in the dark. There was just one problem. As Scott turned and looked around, he realized that in his rush to find his sister, and with the shadows twisting as the sun set, he'd gotten turned around somewhere. He wasn't sure what direction the camp was in. After a moment of panic, Scott took a deep breath and calmed himself. He'd be all right. It was his sister that he was worried about. He had to focus for her sake. As he stood in place, calming his breathing, Scott listened. Soon enough he could make out the sound of water in the distance. That must be the creek he'd set up camp next to. With a renewed sense of determination, Scott reoriented himself and set off as the wind began picking up. She was quite pleasantly surprised with how readily the male accepted the presence of her hand. It had even shared some of the dried flesh of one of its animal carcasses with the hand. This was very promising for the prospect of a partnership between she and the tool users. However, the one she'd most have to impress would be the female, who was still out in the forest somewhere. She didn't have many eyes in the area, but started looking for the female with those that were near at hand. There were plenty of signs of the females passing, but they looped around and back into each other, making tracking the female a near impossibility. What was worse? She could sense cold weather approaching, and the wind was getting turbulent. Perhaps the female would know what to do, but the male would probably be helpless in such unpredictable weather. She contemplated how best to protect the male when the smaller creature walked up to her hand and lightly tugged on the hand. She turned the hand to face the male, who started vibrating at the hand. While she couldn't make out much of what the tool user was trying to express, one thing that made sense was the vibration. Brother, which was the creature's vibration for the female pack leader. While she was concerned for the female, the small male was far more vulnerable at the moment, so she made up her mind. She started moving her hand, and the male followed it like before. She needed to get the male somewhere to protect it from the coming wind and rain, and was only aware of one location near at hand that she was sure wasn't occupied by something that would be dangerous to the helpless male. As the rain started, Scott found the source of the water sound from before. It was a creek, but either he was in a different spot along the creek bed, or this was a different creek altogether. But with the rain picking up, it didn't much matter. Alice was probably still out here somewhere, and he needed to find her. With frustration, he turned and shouted into the wind.
"Alice, where are you, Munchkin?"
The only sound he heard in response was the distant rumble of thunder. With no other option presenting itself, Scott started walking along the creek in the direction he hoped the campsite was in. As Alice followed the spider person, it started to rain. Alice wrapped her hands around herself, but it didn't help much, and she began to shiver. She hoped they'd find Scott soon. Alice occasionally spoke to the spider person, but the most it would do to respond was to pause for a second to look back in her direction before it began moving again. So before long, Alice stopped speaking and just followed, shivering in the rain. After some time, they came across a cave, and the spider person crawled inside, leaving Alice alone in the rain. A part of Alice wanted to follow, to get out of the rain, but the cave looked odd. Its walls were something between pink and red, with shades of purple throughout, and when she touched it, the walls were slightly soft, almost like touching skin. It was weird, and she didn't like it. Then, to make things worse, there was a flash of lightning followed by the rumble of thunder. Alice squeaked out in fear before calling out for her guide.
Hello, Mr. Spider Person? Are you in there? Can we keep looking for my brother?
After a moment, she could make out the legs of the spider person returning. But before it came into view, she realized there were too many legs. There were other spider people in the cave. More and more movement showed there were many more, dozens at least. Alice felt an icy shiver of fear go down her spine, but her legs refused to move. What if Scott was right? What if the spiders did want to eat her? Then there was more movement. Something massive in the back began crawling into the light, many, many times bigger than the spider people Alice had seen before now. Alice felt her heart racing as she gasped for breath. She screamed, and the world went dark. She looked at the fallen form of the male tool user, contemplating what to do now. Perhaps she'd been too late, and it had died from too much exposure to the falling water, upsetting its delicate thermal balance. She reached out with one of her hands, but the small male still seemed to be breathing and had a heartbeat. She gently picked up the small tool user with one of her hands and brought it into She's home, where it could warm up safely. The tool user would likely need nutrition, so she reached out with one of her hands to return to the tool user's nest and retrieve some of the dried flesh to bring back to the remnants of the ancestral home. Scott was shivering and exhausted by the time he found his camp and stumbled in. Against all logic, he hoped Alice would be there, snug and dry in the lean-to he'd made, but when he looked inside, there was nothing but the damp padding he'd put down waiting for him. He'd probably never find her in the rain this late at night, but that made it all the more critical that Scott go out and find her. If he was struggling, there was no way she'd survive out there in this storm. He was trying to figure out how to fan out and explore so he didn't get lost again when a crashing sound outside caught his attention. Scott rushed out, expecting to see his sister stumbling through the campsite, but was met instead by the form of one of those giant spiders picking through the remnants of one of his smokers. Without thinking, Scott reached beside the lean-to the spear he'd stored there the night before, then charged the spider monster. The spider turned and hissed, causing Scott to slow his advance. They'd never shown any kind of threat or warning before, and this show of aggression made him hesitate, crouching low but staying ready. For the spider to come into his camp and bumble around his smokers like this probably meant it was desperately hungry. Scott took comfort that this probably meant it hadn't recently fed on his sister, and he wasn't about to give it the chance to rectify that situation. Scott charged forward again, stabbing down with his spear, but the spider scurried back, just out of his reach. Scott lunged forward again, driving the spear forward in case it stepped back again, but the spider dodged to the side this time. Bracing his foot in the mud, Scott swung the spear to the side, intending to catch the spider's front legs with the spear's shaft, only to slip in the mud and land face down beside the monster. This was the end. Scott knew it would be a simple matter for the spider monster to take advantage of his vulnerability and finish him off, but he struggled to his feet anyway, slipping and sliding in the mud as he did so. However, against all odds, he regained his footing, only to find the spider now a few dozen feet away, regarding him silently. It was as though the thing was trying to understand the human. Something about this infuriated Scott, and he threw his spear, only for the spider to easily sidestep the spear and then begin to actually approach the human. Realizing throwing his spear was probably one of the stupidest things he could have done just then, Scott pulled out his pocket knife and prepared to defend himself as best he could, knowing he'd probably thrown away his last chance at survival. But rather than pounce, the spider stopped short, then turned around and walked a few feet away, only to turn and look back again. If Scott didn't know better, he'd suspect it was trying to express something. It was almost like it wanted him to follow. It was so ridiculous that Scott couldn't help but stop and laugh. Here he was, trying to kill some hungry spider monster, and it was acting like some dog. It was all too ridiculous. What was next? Playing fetch with spiders? Still, whatever was going on, Scott wasn't stupid enough to trust a spider of all things. Eventually, after trying to walk back and forth a few more times, the spider seemed to give up and turned and walked away, leaving Scott alone again, shivering in the rain. She was somewhat frustrated. At least the female stopped trying to kill her hand, but it didn't seem willing to follow her. Her brief attempt to communicate through vibrating the air with her hand's mouth had been of limited success. At least it had slowed the female's assault, but it was clear that the fact that she'd been trying to communicate with the tool user had been lost on the creature. If she was going to get the female's help to aid the male, who was still not awake, she'd have to move up her planes a little. Still, at least she'd retrieved some of the dried flesh they'd had at their nest, though exposure to the falling water probably shortened the span, during which it would be safe for the tool user's consumption. With her main body, she began designing another specialized appendage. Originally, she'd planned on waiting until she had a better grasp of the tool user's vibrations, but if she was to get the female's help in time, some form of communication was necessary, even if it was lacking in complexity. Meanwhile, she needed to care for the male. First, she'd need to compensate for the nutritional deficiency it was experiencing due to cold and hunger. Usually the tool users would chew their food, but with the male unconscious, it was incapable of doing so. It would be simple for she to dissolve the dried flesh into a more palatable pasty, but she also needed to make sure none of the processing agents she used would harm the tool user. Upon closer inspection of the mandible area of the tool user, it became apparent the bony structures that jutted out of the top and bottom of their orifice did much of the work in preparing the flesh for consumption. But they also secreted a thin, mucus-like substance, probably to aid in consuming the pulverized flesh. Grinding the flesh into a paste was easy enough, using 2 stones as tools to do the job. Then, to remove any microbial additions the stones provided, she simply consumed the flesh first and regurgitated the remnants into a paste whose only chemical additions were virtually identical to the mucus the tool users produced from their mandible orifice. It was a novel experience, using external objects to resolve a complication like this. Her time observing these tool users was obviously impacting her problem-solving methods. Whether that would turn out to be a strength or weakness is something only time could tell. With the flesh paste now prepared, she placed a small amount inside the mandible area of the male. After a moment, the tool user swallowed the gelatinous flesh, so she repeated the process, intending to ensure the male's survival until the female could be brought to his aid. Scott stumbled back to his lean-to in defeat. After a night of searching, he'd found nothing. A small voice in the back of his mind told him that she was likely dead, but Scott shoved those thoughts to the side. He'd get a little rest, then resume his search. Just a short nap is all, an hour or two at most. He collapsed onto the leaf mat, stripped off his soggy clothes to let them hang dry, and promptly passed out. Luckily for she, the female had returned and seemed to be resting. Now was the best time to try out her new appendage. She readied her new vibration produce himself. It was far smaller than initially planned to allow for faster construction, but she could incorporate the successes and failures of this experiment into more complete selves down the line. She's plan was simple. Call out to the female to wake it up, then explain that the male was in her care, and that the female's presence was needed to prevent further complications. Given she's lack of understanding of the vibration-based language, it was best to keep things succinct and direct. Scott awoke to an odd, almost ethereal voice calling out to him.
Brother, here, brother.
That made Scott blink. At first he thought he was dreaming, but the voice continued.
Here, brother, here.
Whatever was calling out to him, that was not his sister. The voice sounded wrong. It was as if two people were speaking nearly simultaneously but not getting the timing right. One seemed to be talking while gurgling water, while the other sounded like it had marbles in its mouth. Still, as disturbing as the voice was, he had to know more. Thankfully, the voice stopped and waited while he got dressed. Scott noticed his clothes were mostly dry. More time had passed than he'd first thought. Then, grabbing hold of his spear for comfort, if nothing else, he lifted the improvised leaf door and stepped out of his lean-to. As he stepped out, he looked around, not seeing anything, until the voice spoke again, drawing his attention down to what was best described as an almost normal-sized spider with a mouth. But not a regular spider mouth, which was already disturbing enough. Instead, it had a human-ish one, or at least close enough to make Scott shiver in something between fear and revulsion while it spoke.
She has Munchkin. Brother, come or else.
That got Scott's attention. He brandished his spear.
Who has my sister? Where is she?
But the spider just repeated itself.
She has Munchkin. Brother, come or else.
Then it started scuttling over to one of the larger spider monsters and got on its back. The spider monster then repeated its action from the previous night of walking a few steps, then stopping and looking back while the mouth spider repeated,
Brother, come.
This was wrong on so many levels. Scott was sure this was all some weird nightmare, and he just needed to wake up to resume his search for his sister. But when he pinched himself, all it did was hurt. Meanwhile, the mouth spider seemed to grow impatient.
Brother, come now or else.
Scott wanted nothing more than to attack the mouth spider and wipe it from existence. But it had said Munchkin. That was his name for his sister. Given the storm last night, there were two probabilities. Either whoever the mouth spider was talking about did have his sister, or she was most likely already dead. Since, in the latter situation, there wasn't anything he could do, Scott decided to follow the horrifying mouth spider riding on the back of one of the larger spider monsters and find out what was going on.